Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence, and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe, and share. The year was 1856, in the damp heat of Mississippi's river country, where cotton swelled fat along the levees, and the air carried a perfume of magnolia, mud, and sweat. It was there, on the manicured grounds of Riverside Plantation, that a marriage feast was to be held. Addison Riverside, heir to the family's fortune, was to wed a woman of good breeding, and the house had been readied for spectacle. But beneath the whitewashed colonnades and the polished silver, another story was fermenting. A story not inscribed in ledgers or announced in church bulletins, but whispered later, in fragments from the mouths of servants, from the edges of county court records, and from pages curiously blotted in family Bibles. At its center stood Celia Washington. She was not born to that name. The name Washington was one she later claimed, quietly and defiantly, when she carved her own identity from the chains that bound her. In the Riverside household she was known only as Celia, a cook of rare talent, summoned daily to command the kitchen's heat, the knives, the mortars, the fragrant stores of spice. She had learned early that her food could disarm, soothe, or seduce. That evening, it would do something else entirely. The preparations for the feast were exacting. A guest list of 40 would dine beneath the flicker of gas lamps and the attentive gaze of Colonel Thompson, Addison's uncle, whose presence carried both authority and suspicion. The Riverside matriarch, Pearl Riverside, insisted on perfection. Oysters arranged in shells on beds of salt, turkeys trussed in neat twine, cakes laced with almond extract and sugar drawn to crisp. Yet Pearl, like her husband Samuel, failed to notice how Celia's hand lingered over the spice rack, how she ground powders more finely than necessary, or how she set aside a small vial marked only with the faint residue of crushed leaves. Later reports described the meal itself with unnerving reverence. Testimonies from survivors, few as they were, spoke of flavors unusually vivid, of meat that seemed to melt on the tongue, of wines that warmed not only the body but the head, as if intoxication had arrived too swiftly. Somewhere between the soup and the main course, voices began to waver. The laughter of Addison's bride caught on a cough. A guest raised his goblet and set it down half full, suddenly pale. The hall, so carefully decorated with garlands of cotton and silk ribbons, grew hushed as bodies shifted uneasily, as if the air itself were tightening. Celia, from her post at the doorway, kept her silence. By midnight the feast had dissolved into horror. Men clutched their bellies, women retched into lace napkins. Colonel Thompson staggered from his chair, collapsing onto the floorboards with a crack that split his cane. Servants rushed to and fro, carrying basins, fetching doctors, summoning priests. Some claimed the odor of bitter almonds lingered in the air. Others swore it was closer to swamp herbs, the kind that grew wild where snakes curled in the reeds. When dawn broke, the Riverside household was crippled. Of the assembled family, 10 lay dead, including Addison's young bride. Others lingered in agony for days, their skin graying, their eyes sunken, until they too surrendered. The surviving records are uneven. Death registers in Adams County list dates uncertain, margins scribbled with correction. It is as though someone at some later time had tried to obscure the scope of what occurred. But one fact remained constant across every version. The hand behind the feast was Celia Washington's. How she obtained her knowledge is less clear. Some suggested she learned from apothecaries' manuals left carelessly in the master's library. Others whispered that field slaves carried with them remedies, roots and tinctures that doubled as poisons when given in different measure. One testimony, redacted in the official transcript, claimed Celia had once been caught boiling herbs in the night, whispering names as though in prayer. Whether she acted in madness or in method, the result was the same. The Riverside lineage cracked upon itself, its wealth soured into scandal. For weeks, papers across the South murmured in veiled terms of a poisonous supper, but dared not print Celia's name. Her fate in those first hours remains obscured. Some say she fled into the swamps, guided by lantern lights that only the desperate or the damned could follow. Others insist she was hidden by sympathizers, carried northward by the same invisible hands that moved fugitives along clandestine paths. What lingers is not the certainty of her escape, but the certainty of her act. Celia Washington had waited. She had turned the household's own celebration into its undoing. In later retellings, her vengeance grew mythic. Parish ledgers bear annotations in different hands, as though multiple clerks tried to reconcile the losses. An 1857 entry in the Southern Medical Journal discusses curious cases of gastric corrosion following a wedding supper in Adams County, though the names are replaced with initials. Even the Washington surname she adopted became part of the legend, a declaration of independence, an irony bitter and sweet. And so what began as a wedding day intended to secure the Riverside family's prosperity became instead its ruin. A single woman, long denied her children her dignity, her name, served death across porcelain plates gilded in gold. The plantation would never recover its former luster. This was only the beginning. The story doesn't end with the feast. In many ways it begins there. What followed was silence, rumors, and a fear that seemed to seep into the walls of Riverside itself. If you're still here, like and subscribe, because history this dark is rarely spoken aloud. The Riverside plantation house stood in eerie stillness in the days after the wedding. The grand columns, once symbols of wealth and permanence, seemed now like gravestones. Guests who survived the supper had fled to neighboring estates, their carriages rattling down the dirt roads in frantic retreat. Inside, the few servants left swept at stains that refused to fade, dark splatters on linen, smears on wood, where bodies had collapsed, and a smell of sickness that no amount of lye or vinegar could erase. The local doctor, Elias Whitworth, came on the second morning. He examined the bodies laid out in the parlor, though he refused to touch his breakfast when it was offered. His notes, later discovered in his personal journal, describe burning of the throat and stomach, consistent with irritant poisons, likely arsenic or aconite. Yet he left the report unsigned, as if afraid to anchor his own name to the event. From that day forward, the Riverside name fell like a curse. Families who once sought connection through marriage began to whisper, "There's rot in that house." Merchants who extended credit grew hesitant. Even the church pew that bore the Riverside initials remained conspicuously empty for weeks, until at last the plaque was removed entirely, and at the center of every whisper was the same question: what became of the cook? No one agreed. A field hand named Jacob swore he saw Celia walking into the cypress swamp, her skirts trailing through the water as though she meant to vanish into the muck. Another servant claimed she never left the house at all, that she slipped into the root cellar as the family convulsed upstairs and was never seen again, her bones perhaps moldering beneath the very floorboard. In Natchez, miles away, a newspaper hinted at a fugitive woman fitting her description boarding a flatboat at night, but just as quickly as the rumor was printed, the column was cut from later editions, leaving only torn gaps in surviving copies. The uncertainty fueled her legend. By autumn of that year, Celia Washington was no longer just a runaway or a suspected murderer. She became a kind of phantom, invoked by the enslaved in hushed tones. She walks still, they said, feeding poison into the mouths of masters who grow fat on others' suffering. Mothers frightened children into obedience by warning them of the cook who served death as supper. Plantation mistresses whispered prayers when they stirred their stews, suddenly unsure whether the hand beside them at the hearth might carry similar resolve. The Riverside estate itself withered. Cotton still grew, but buyers offered less. Overseers came and went, none lasting long. At night, new tenants reported hearing sounds in the kitchen, the scrape of knives, the low simmer of pots, though no fire was lit. One overseer's wife claimed she woke to find the pantry door open and a faint smell of bitter almonds in the air. Years later, when the plantation changed hands, the new owner, Henry Caldwell, ordered the kitchen hearth torn apart. Beneath the stone, masons found a narrow glass vial stoppered with wax. Inside clung a powder the color of bone dust. Caldwell had it buried at once, but his household never knew peace. The story spread far beyond Mississippi. Letters discovered in Louisiana and Georgia speak of that cook in Adams County as though she were a warning sent by Providence. Ministers thundered from pulpits. Rebellion brews not only in fields but in kitchens. Some said the North exaggerated her tale as propaganda. Others whispered that masters themselves suppressed the truth, terrified of imitation. Yet no matter who spoke, the outcome was the same. Fear sat at every table. But behind all this folklore, a quieter, grimmer truth remained. Celia's revenge was not spontaneous. It was patiently cultivated. She had studied her craft, measured her moments, and selected her night with care. The wedding feast was no random supper. It was the ultimate humiliation for her captors to die with wine still on their lips, with music still playing, with hope for new generations snuffed out before it began. What makes her story endure is not only the audacity of her act, but the silence that followed. No court record, no public hanging, no formal confession. She seemed to dissolve into the gaps of history itself, leaving only question. Did she flee northward and live under her chosen name, Washington, in freedom? Did she drown in the swamps, claimed by waters that swallowed so many fugitives? Or did she linger near the ruins of Riverside, her shadow becoming the house's final inhabitant? That ambiguity is what keeps her alive even now, for when we speak of Celia, we are not simply recounting a crime, we are confronting the truth that systems of domination, left unchecked, create their own execution. Celia was not the first to resist, nor the last, but hers was resistance wrapped in ceremony. Staged at the very table meant to celebrate wealth and lineage, she transformed the tools of servitude, the kitchen, the ladle, the spices, into instruments of retribution. Perhaps that is why her story survived when so many others were buried, because it frightens, because it warns, because it reminds every listener that silence is never permanent. Even today, locals say that if you walk the grounds where Riverside once stood, overgrown now with kudzu and briars, you might catch the scent of something strange on the wind. Not rot, not blossom, but something acrid, bitter, medicinal. And if you follow it, they say, you may hear a voice low and steady, repeating the same words that once marked her transformation. My name is Washington. By the winter after the Riverside wedding, Celia's name had already crossed county lines. Field workers who escaped their plantations carried her story with them, reshaping it with every retelling. Some claimed she had fed aconite to the Riverside family, others swore it was powdered glass, ground so fine it dissolved into the grave, and a few insisted it wasn't poison at all, that Celia had whispered a curse into the pot, a spell passed down from ancestors stolen out of West Africa. The truth mattered less than the every version of her story ended the same way. The masters convulsed, the house fell silent, and Celia disappeared like smoke. In Mississippi taverns, men spoke her name like a warning. Keep your eye on the cook, they'd mutter between gulps of whiskey. Merchants grew suspicious of women buying too much saltpeter or herbs from the apothecary. Even simple kitchen staples, juniper, nutmeg, bitter almond, took on a sinister air. Some planters banned their servants from entering the pantry unsupervised. Fear itself became Celia's weapon, and she didn't even have to lift a hand to wield it. Meanwhile, among the enslaved, her story took on the shape of a hymn of resistance. Around fire pits, mothers would whisper to their children, "There was once a woman who made the masters eat their own." Elders would hum work songs with her name stitched quietly into the verses, careful never to let the overseer hear. And on rare nights of celebration after harvests, or secret gatherings by the river, her tale was told as if she were a folk saint. The details shift. Some said she walked barefoot all the way to Ohio, living free under her new name. Others believed she found refuge with the Maroons, hidden deep in the swamps feeding on wild rice and fish. But in every telling she was alive. To admit otherwise would have been
the story's twist. Of course, not all retellings honored her. Some white writers in the 1850s twisted her tale into a grotesque caricature, turning Celia into a figure of horror to justify tighter control. One pamphlet, The Devil in the Kitchen, depicted her as a witch who lured men to their doom with her cooking. It sold widely in New Orleans, stoking panic and superstition. But the irony was this: even as they tried to demonize her, they kept her name alive. Every retelling, faithful or twisted, added fuel to the legend. And legends do not die easily. The ghost of Riverside. By the turn of the decade, the Riverside plantation itself had become a husk. Tenants who rented the land complained of strange dreams. One overseer claimed he saw a woman standing at the edge of the field at dusk, watching the rows of cotton sway. She never moved when he called out, and when he walked closer, she was gone. Children in the county began daring each other to walk past the Riverside kitchen at night. They whispered that you could still hear the simmer of pots inside, though no fire burned. A boy once swore he found a spoon lying in the ashes of the hearth, too hot to touch though the room was cold. These stories piled one on another until Celia was no longer a woman at all. She was a haunting. the cook who poisoned a family, the runaway who vanished into the swamp, the whisper in the kitchen, the shadow at the edge of the field, all of them were Celia, and none of them could be erased. The meaning beneath. What makes her story so chilling is not just the act itself, but what it revealed. Celia's revenge was never just personal. It became a mirror held up to the entire system. Every master who sat down to supper after that night at Riverside had to wonder who prepared this. Every bite carried suspicion. Every glass of wine trembled with unease, and that suspicion was poison in itself. Slow, invisible, and lasting far longer than any herb or powder. That was Celia's true weapon. She had infected the system with its own fear. So did Celia Washington survive to see the ripples of her act spread across the South, or did she vanish into the soil, leaving only her legend to do the work for her? The answer may never be known, but what cannot be denied is that her story, whether spoken in anger, fear, or reverence, refused to die, and more than a century later, the name Celia Washington still carries the weight of a warning. After the wedding night massacre, the official records of Riverside Plantation were carefully scrubbed. Parish registries list the sudden deaths of the Beechworth family in vague terms: fever, unseasonable illness, Providence's hand. Not one mentions the possibility of poison. Marriage ledgers for that year contain no bride, no groom, only a broken ink blot where names should have stood. Pages in the county log are missing, torn out in deliberate haste. Even the household inventory, usually meticulous, jumps suspiciously from copper pots to linen draperies, skipping any mention of kitchen stores. One surviving letter, discovered in a private collection decades later, contained only a single bitter line from a neighboring planter: "We are not to speak her name lest others take courage." The name, of course, was Celia Washington. Between silence and song, but while the archives grew thin, oral tradition thickened. Among enslaved communities, Celia's story was repeated in secret, reshaped to fit the teller's tongue. One version remembered her as a woman who slipped poison into a decanter of wine. Another claimed she prepared a wedding cake, whose sweetness hid the bitterness of crushed seeds. Some claimed she sang while she cooked low, humming notes that twisted into curses, and that it was the song, not the food, that sealed the family's fate. The records gave her the people gave her presence, and between those two the truth remained unsteady, like a shadow caught between firelight and moonlight. The Civil War and after. When war broke out in 1861, whispers of Celia's act returned with force. Union soldiers marching through Mississippi wrote in their diaries of tales told by Negro women of a slave poisoner who avenged her people. Southern officers, in contrast, dismissed her as a Yankee invention meant to stir up discontent. But after the war ended, when emancipation was finally law, something curious happened. Celia's legend grew quieter, not gone, never gone, but less spoken aloud. Newly freed families often chose silence, not because they forgot, but because they understood the danger of memory. White historians of the Reconstruction era had no desire to preserve a tale of resistance that undermined the myth of happy servitude, and so the gaps widened. Books published in the 1870s and 1880s mention poisonings only in broad strokes, with no names, no dates, no place. The Beechworths of Riverside, once a prominent family, were reduced in print to a footnote. The estate dissolved in the late 80s. In 1873, a journal article in the Southern Medical Record discussed instances of mass convulsion occasioned by ingestion of alkaloids concealed in food. It never named Celia, but the timing and description matched Riverside precise. Marginalia scrawled in pencil in one surviving copy reads, "Washington, the cook, beware the kitchen." Another fragment surfaced in a ward log from a Confederate infirmary. A surgeon wrote of soldiers who refused to eat what is served, for they believe the black women may have learned from Washington, the poisoner. The word Washington was underlined twice, then half blotted out in ink. Each of these scraps is like a stitch. On their own they reveal little, but together they piece back a tapestry of memory the official histories tried to shred, folklore and fear. By the late 19th century, Celia had become less of a person and more of a folk presence. Children of freedmen were told to be proud of her, though rarely in public. Songs carried her name in whispers: "Celia stir, Celia pour, masters fall and rise no more." Traveling storytellers wove her into cautionary tales for white listeners: a bogey woman in the pantry, a witch with ladles for hands. In every telling she was dangerous, and that danger was exactly why she endured. The curse of the kitchen. Perhaps the strangest survival of Celia's legend comes not from black folklore, but from white superstition. Plantation kitchens across the South, many abandoned after emancipation, developed reputations as haunted places. Servants refused to work alone near the old hearths. Guests reported sudden nausea at suppers, though nothing spoiled had been served. In one Mississippi county, families began marking kitchen doors with chalk crosses, a ritual meant to ward off Celia's spirit. In another, cooks were forbidden from humming while they worked, lest it be mistaken for a Washington spell. Her act had slipped from fact into haunting, and haunts are harder to erase than history. The split memory, and so by the dawn of the 20th century, Celia Washington lived two parallel lives. In the archives she did not exist. The Beechworths died of fever, the plantation dissolved, and the pages fell silent. In the memory of the people she was alive in every ladle, every suspicious bite, every whispered story told beside the fire. To the powerful she was a ghost best forgotten. To the powerless, she was a proof that forgetting was impossible. The meaning of silence. But silence itself is its own testimony. Every missing page, every torn register, every careful redaction reveals the shape of something deliberately hidden. And what is hidden has weight, because here we are, more than 170 years later, still piecing together the truth from fragments, still saying her name, still unsettled by what she did, and what it meant. The archives erased her, but erasure leaves its own scars, and if you read those scars closely, they whisper, Celia was here. Science does not always bring light. Sometimes it sharpens the shadows, lending new instruments to old terror. Tonight we examine how doctors and surgeons sought to explain the deaths at Riverside plantation, and how their failures left only fear behind. If this tale unsettles you, remember to subscribe. More histories like this survive only in fragments. The night of convulsions. Accounts, though inconsistent, agree on the symptoms. The Beechworth family and their wedding guests began to fall ill within an hour of the feast. At first there was mild complaint, parched throats, dryness of mouth, then a series of violent spasms overtook them. Eyewitnesses describe eyes rolling back, jaws stiffening, limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. One woman reportedly fractured her own teeth biting down during the convulsions. Another tore the fabric of her gown in an effort to claw her abdomen. Several fell to the floor foaming at the mouth, their tongues bitten through, their skin taking on a waxy pallid sheen. By dawn most were dead. Those who lived spoke only in fragments before lapsing into feverish delirium, and few of them survived the following day. The surgeons arrive. Colonel Thompson, overseeing the county militia, summoned two physicians, Dr. Alonzo Pierce, a local doctor, known for his obstetric practice, and Dr. Horace Welling, a younger surgeon freshly trained in New Orleans. Both men kept ward journals, though much of their notes were later redacted or misfiled. What survives suggests equal parts science and superstition. Dr. Pierce wrote, symptoms resemble epilepsy, though contagion of such scale improbable, likely cause corrupted food or unseen miasma. Flesh of birds examined, no evidence of spoil. Dr. Welling, by contrast, was more blunt. A malignancy administered, the stomachs burned without fire. I suspect tincture of strychnos, perhaps mixed with seeds of datura, yet who could procure such substances, and for what purpose? His marginal note, later half scratched away, read simply, the cook. Instruments of inquiry. The two doctors attempted crude examinations of the dead, using bone saws, scalpels and calipers. They opened several bodies in the smokehouse that had been cleared for the purpose. Pierce measured the swelling of the intestines with a brass ruler, recording the dimensions to the half-inch. Welling applied a magnifying lens to the lining of the stomach, searching for telltale abrasions. Neither man fully understood what he saw, but their descriptions are chilling. Pierce, viscera, mottled as if bruised, blood dark, congealed, lungs collapsed as if by drowning, though airways were dry. Welling, musculature stiff beyond rigor, drawn taut like wire, suggests violent contraction at death, as of poison working upon the nerve. The bodies were then hastily buried, for fear of contagion, but the journals preserved their grotesque post-mortem echoes. Apothecary's cabinet. What poisons might Celia have used? Historians argue, but the possibilities narrow to a few. Strychnine, derived from the Strychnos nux vomica tree, was known to apothecaries in the 1840s. Even a grain could produce convulsions exactly like those described. Datura seeds called devil's snare grew wild in Mississippi. Crushed and added to food, they produced delirium, hallucinations and death. Arsenic, though common, usually left the skin sallow and the stomach ulcerated, symptoms not clearly noted in the ward logs. Whatever she chose, Celia would not have needed much. A spoonful of the right powder stirred into punch or batter could bring down dozens, and as a cook entrusted with preparing the feast, she had access no one questioned. The forensic failure, yet despite their tools and guesses, Pierce and Welling could not prove poison. Chemical testing was still crude in 1847. The marsh test for arsenic existed, but required delicate equipment the plantation did not possess. No reliable test yet existed for strychnine or datura. Thus the doctors circled suspicion without confirmation. They whispered of malign agencies, ungovernable humors, even the devil's own draft. The lack of proof became its own shield. In the absence of certainty, the county court recorded the deaths as fever, allowing the Beechworth relatives to bury shame along with the body. Echoes in the journals. A strange detail lingers in Dr. Welling's later notes, preserved in the Transactions of the Southern Medical Association. In a case study published in 1852, he described a patient seized by convulsions after drinking tainted liquor. Though the article never named Riverside, a marginal pencil mark in one surviving copy reads, "Again the Washington case." It seems Welling carried the suspicion with him, unable or unwilling to set it aside. Pierce, meanwhile, abandoned his practice soon after. Parish records list him as deceased in 1850, fever again cited as cause. Some say he died raving, convinced that Celia's poison had reached him belatedly, a curse lingering in his veins. The medical horror. What makes this chapter terrifying is not only the deaths themselves, but the inability of science to face them. The doctors opened bodies, measured tissue, handled viscera, with brass instruments polished to a shine, yet they stood helpless. Their knowledge ended where Celia's cunning began. Imagine it, a woman denied literacy, denied freedom, yet able to wield more knowledge of roots and powders than two trained physicians, and for that the record had to silence her. To admit her skill would be to admit their ignorance. To admit her vengeance would be to admit their guilt. So they buried the bodies, closed the journals, and whispered only in margins. Legacy of poison, but poison.
Though their first examinations failed, both Dr. Pierce and Dr. Welling fed into the new superstition. Pierce's final notebook, recovered from his estate sale, contains this strange entry dated January 1848. Convulsions, not confined to those at table. A cousin in Natchez reports like symptoms, though no poison ingested. I suspect a humoral alteration transmissible in blood. Degeneration follows. Children born twitching, eyes glassy as if memory of poison carried through the veins. Modern readers may dismiss this as delirium, yet his note echoed what many already believed, that the Beechworths had become hereditary carriers of death. The surviving children, 2 young Beechworth children, had been absent from the feast. Their nurse had taken them upriver, away from the wedding. These survivors should have been free of suspicion. Yet as they grew, the community watched with dread. The eldest, Thomas, was said to suffer seizures in adolescence, spasms that bent his spine backward, recalling the convulsions of his poisoned kin. The younger, Eliza, grew pale and frail, unable to bear light or heat. Parish matrons whispered she had poison in the eyes, that even her gaze carried death. Neither married, neither bore heirs. Some say their line died with them. Others suggest their offspring were hidden, unbaptized, records erased to conceal the taint. Inheritance of fear. The Beechworth estate was eventually broken apart, parcels sold to cover debts, but documents of sale include a curious clause: purchaser to acknowledge the land carries repute of corruption, no claim against heirs for sickness or death ensuing. Land itself became stained by rumor. Laborers swore the soil bred only bitter roots, that water drawn from the wells caused stomach cramps. Even decades later, maps sometimes mark the area as poison ground. Celia's lineage, equally haunting were the whispers about Celia herself. Though she vanished from records, no court execution, no manumission, no confirmed burial, the community did not forget her.
Instead, she became myth, a kind of shadow matriarch. Some said she escaped and bore children elsewhere, her bloodline carrying secret knowledge of powders and herbs. Others claimed her bones were hidden under the kitchen hearth, ensuring that every meal at Riverside remained under her dominion. A note in an 1872 herbalist's manual includes a chilling marginal scribble: "The cook's seed survives. Beware of her daughters. They carry death in milk." No name is given, only that phrase, "the cook's seed." Degeneration as science. By the mid-19th century, the language of heredity and degeneration entered medical discourse. Phrenologists measured skulls, eugenicists traced lineages, physicians claimed to detect moral taint in the body's very form. The Beechworth case became a private exemplar. In lectures at Tulane Medical College, unnamed families were cited as proof that poison may, by alteration of the humors, imprint corruption upon the race. Though Celia's name never appeared in print, one set of lecture notes now in Tulane archives includes a sketch of a convulsing figure caption, "Washington Miss, 1847, thus gossip hardened into science, sealing the family's curse under the authority of medicine." The heredity of revenge. What terrifies most in this chapter is how an act of revenge, swift, calculated, personal, was twisted into an enduring superstition. Celia's single night of poison became, in the eyes of neighbors, an eternal inheritance. Her vengeance thus escaped her body, her time, even her name. It entered the blood of those she hated, and more disturbingly became entwined with her own rumored descendants. Did Celia know? Did she intend not only death, but a stain that would spread through generations? Or did the community, desperate to explain what it could not contain, invent the curse for her? Either way, her legacy was no longer a meal or a death, but a myth of poisoned blood. The genealogical absence. Attempting to trace the Beechworths today, one encounters a curious silence. Census rolls skip the family after 8. Wills list unknown heirs. Parish registers redact certain names with heavy ink, the kind used by archivists to cover scandal. It is as though the family was erased deliberately, roots cut, branches burned, yet absence itself is suspicious. What is hidden tends to survive in rumor, and rumor, when fed, becomes history. Conflicting testimonies. In February of 1848, 6 months after the wedding, a coroner's inquest was quietly convened in Natchez. Its proceedings should have clarified the matter, but what survives only muddies it further. One surviving guest, a distant cousin, testified that Celia had been seen smiling as the dishes were cleared. Another, under oath, swore she was not even present in the hall that evening, having been confined to the scullery. Both could not be true, yet both depositions remain side by side without correction. The minutes conclude with a peculiar phrase, underlined twice: "No further inquiry, for fear of disturbing peace." Peace, it seems, was more valuable than truth. Gaslighted memory. Those who lived claimed later that they could no longer trust their recollection. Thomas, the surviving son, left behind a journal in which he wrote at age 19, "I hear their cries still, though I cannot swear it happened. I am told by aunts that I was not even there, though I know I stood in that hall. They say I dream, that my visions are but fever. Yet why does the smell of almonds seize me though none are near?" This passage reveals a mind fractured by insistence that his own memory was false. His seizures may have been neurological, but the deeper wound was doubt itself. The parish's silence. Clerical correspondence preserved in the diocesan chest shows deliberate avoidance. A bishop's letter advises, "Do not speak of the feast, save in generalities. The family has suffered enough. The community must not dwell on poisons." Erasure is charity, but silence is never neutral. It shifts blame onto the whisperers, the doubters, those who remember too clearly. Celia thus became doubly erased, first by absence of trial, then by enforced muteness around her name. The disappearing cook. The most chilling absence is Celia herself. No execution recorded, no bill of sale to another owner, no burial, no manumission papers. Some archives contain an inventory slip, catalogued under Riverside Estate, 1849. One female cook, mulatto, mid-30s. Status, not accounted for, not accounted for. A bureaucratic phrase, yet it screams, how can a woman vanish so entirely, leaving only recipes whispered among descendants, fragments of herbs in folded papers, marginal notes in ledgers that half remember her existence, unless of course she did not vanish, unless she was made to vanish. Psychological inheritance. Eliza, the Beechworth daughter, lived to age 27. Her surviving letters, collected by a distant cousin, paint a portrait of deterioration. I cannot recall if mother sang at the feast, or if I only dreamt it. They tell me she never sang, that she wept instead. Each day they correct me, each night I lie awake, fearing my mind is no longer mine. This is the horror not of poison but of unmoored identity. When one cannot trust memory, the self unravels. Eliza's final letter, dated April 1863, ends with,
"The archivist's dread. To handle these items is to feel a chill, unlike any ordinary relic. The ledger's pages give off a faint odor, not only of mold but of something bitter, sharp, almond-like. The recipe book seems to darken when read alone at night, the marginal notes half legible until one blinks and finds them gone. The goblet reflects not one's face but a distortion, as if another gaze peers back. Archivists write of sleeplessness, of dreams of feasts where the laughter turns to gasps. The artifacts do not simply record, they replay, toward confrontation. By the turn of the 20th century, a new generation of historians and physicians began piecing together these scattered fragments. Each object contradicted the official silence. Each surviving trace demanded confrontation. The Beechworth tragedy could no longer be dismissed as spoiled sugar. The artifacts themselves refused the erasure. What began as whispers around hearths, marginalia in hymnals, redacted lines in parish logs, had become incontrovertible material evidence, and so the story prepared to break its last seal, moving from artifact to revelation, from silence to confrontation with those who had most to gain from covering the truth. Objects survive longer than oath. The Beechworths and their witnesses could silence tongues, but the poison itself stained paper silver and glass. No hand, however careful, could bleach away the almond reek that clings to the record. No redaction could prevent a goblet from bearing residue a century later. The artifacts wait, patient, implacable, unanswerable, and together they speak the words, "No witness dared, murder, deliberate, and sweetened with sugar." Ever silence has a breaking point. Every archive, however carefully pruned, grows weeds of truth, and when objects speak in chorus, ledger, goblet, recipe, folio, no gatekeeper can contain them. The Riverside story, once whispered only in kitchens and over grave dirt, began at last to seep into public consciousness. A conference in Natchez, 1923. The first open clash occurred not in a courtroom but at a historical conference in Natchez, spring of 1923. Local historians gathered to present papers on plantation life. The event was meant to be genteel, a celebration of heritage, with speeches on architecture, lineage, and the grace of the Old South. But in one session, a young archivist named Edwin Stokes presented an incendiary paper titled "Evidence of Poison in the Riverside Catastrophe." He displayed photographs of the ledger stains, transcriptions of the apothecary's folio, and chemical assays of the wedding goblet. The room went cold. Elderly descendants of the Beechworth family rose in protest, voices shaking with outrage. "This is slander. This is forgery. You insult our ancestors." But Stokes stood firm. "The evidence is material. These objects testify. If history is to be more than nostalgia, we must listen." The backlash was swift. Newspapers mocked Stokes as a sensational. Wealthy patrons of the Historical Society withdrew funds. One editorial sneered, "To accuse a loyal servant girl of such atrocity is madness. To accuse the respected Beechworth name is libel." Yet letters poured in from private citizens, some anonymous, offering fragments of memory, a grandmother's story, a fragment of song, a shadow of truth that matched his findings. For every attempt to bury the story again, more soil was displaced. Descendants at war. The Beechworth descendants themselves split into factions. One branch, led by Henry Beechworth III, insisted the family honor depended on denial. They sought to suppress circulation of Stokes's paper and threatened loss. Another branch, distant cousins in Louisiana, admitted quietly what they had long suspected, that feast was no accident. "We grew up with the story hushed, but never gone." Private correspondence between these cousins reveals their dread.
It is not only our name at stake. If what the artifacts suggest is true, then our whole inheritance, our wealth, our land, rests on the silence of murder. The church, confronted, pressure soon fell on the Anglican parish that had long held Riverside's burial records. Historians demanded access to unredacted registers. For decades, priests had denied such requests, citing damage, loss, confidentiality. Finally, in 1925, a renegade curate leaked fragments of the burial register. In faint script, preserved under the redactions, one line read, "Cause of death, sudden seizure following confection. Suspicion, administered. Administered. Not spoiled. Not accident. Administered." The parish leadership was forced into humiliating silence. The Medical Society's dilemma. The New Orleans Medical Society, custodian of the apothecary's folio, faced a similar crisis. Physicians debated whether releasing the full text would tarnish the profession by exposing Dunn's role. Some argued it was old scandal, of no present consequence. Others countered, "Our duty is to truth, not reputation." In the end, the folio was quietly published in a small academic journal, its circulation limited, but enough to ensure the evidence could never again be hidden. The web of complicity. As these revelations piled up, the Riverside tragedy no longer appeared as an isolated act of vengeance by one woman. Instead, it revealed a web of complicity, a physician who experimented with poisons, a master who kept surgical instruments in his kitchen, parish officials who censored burial records, descendants who fought to maintain silence, and in the center, Celia, the enslaved cook, long painted as either scapegoat or shadow. The question grew unavoidable. Had she been a solitary avenger, or a pawn in a larger, darker experiment? The haunted reputation. By the late 1920s, Riverside Plantation had become a site of morbid curiosity. Travelers whispered of poisoned feasts, of silver goblets that killed their drinkers. Guidebooks began to include the story, sometimes sanitized, sometimes lurid. Visitors may see the very hall where death was served in sugared cake. The Beechworth descendants could no longer prevent it. Their legacy had become inseparable from the poison, and with each retelling, Celia's figure loomed larger, not as a footnote, but as the axis of the tale. A family decline. More unsettling still was the evidence of hereditary decline. Medical reports traced through parish and probate records revealed that Beechworth descendants across generations suffered nervous disorders, trembling hands, sudden fits, weak lungs. Doctors speculated on congenital defects, but whispered voices said otherwise. They still drink from poisoned blood. The feast of 1847 had not only ended lives, it had cursed a lineage. The archivist's warning. In 1929, shortly before his death, Edwin Stokes wrote a final note, unpublished in his lifetime. The Riverside evidence does not simply reveal an act of revenge, it reveals a structure of silence, a machinery of erasure, preserved across decades. We are all complicit when we prefer heritage over history, and mark this, objects will always betray us. They keep our secrets less faithfully than we think. His warning rings like prophecy. What began as rumor had become artifact. What artifact revealed became confrontation, and what confrontation exposed was not simply one poisoned feast, but the machinery of silence that tried to bury it. By the dawn of the 1930s, Riverside was no longer a genteel ruin of the Old South. It was a tomb whose walls echoed with truth that could not be stifled. And still one question remained unanswered. Who truly had held the vial? Every story seeks its grave, but some refuse to lie still. The Riverside tragedy, 1847's Feast of Poison, did not end in the graveyard, nor in the courthouse, nor in the parish ledger. It lingered, breathed, and adapted, and in the end, it was not the family that survived. It was the memory of Celia. The return of the kitchen. In 1931, the last standing kitchen wing of Riverside Plantation was demolished. Contractors claimed the building was unsafe. Its hearth cracked, its ceiling sagging. But before the stones fell, an observer noted something remarkable. Carved into the inner brick of the hearth, beneath soot and lime, was a faint inscription. Scraped letters, crude but deliberate. Celia, whether etched by her hand, or by another in her memory, no one could say. The foreman who saw it swore the brick felt warmer to the touch than the others, as though it retained heat after a century. The inscription was not preserved. The wall was torn down, the brick carted off. Some said it was buried under the nearby riverbank. Others said fragments were taken as souvenirs, cursed tokens to show friends. But the sight of her name, written in the very heart of her labor, was enough. It became the final spark in igniting Celia's legend. The legend takes shape. By the mid-1930s, ballads began to circulate among African American communities across Mississippi and Louisiana. Songs whispered of the cook who fed her chains to the fire, and the wedding where death was served in sugar. Children dared one another to chant her name before mirrors, believing her face would appear behind them holding a ladle filled with black liquid. To the Beechworth descendants, this was humiliation beyond endurance. They had spent nearly a century rewriting records, suppressing archives, redacting ledgers, yet Celia's story slipped free, not in parchment but in song, and unlike their heritage, which weakened each generation, the legend grew stronger with every telling. The collapse of the family. The Beechworth line dwindled in the 1940s. One son shot himself in a hotel room in Vicksburg. A cousin was institutionalized in New Orleans, prone to fits where he screamed of smoke in the throat and sugar burning the blood. Doctors diagnosed epilepsy, melancholia, neurosis, but in family whispers, the cause was clear. The poison never left. By 1950, Riverside stood abandoned, ivy choking its walls. The once proud estate was no longer a heritage site, but a ruin avoided by locals. Some said animals would not drink from the stream near the kitchen foundations. The family name, once spoken with pride, was now a shuddered curse. The archivist's last folder. In 1962, the Mississippi State Archives received an anonymous donation, a folder stamped Beechworth Confidential. Inside were 3 objects: a stained apron scrap, preserved under glass, a recipe card, its handwriting spidery, titled Almond Confection, for wedding, a single page torn from a parish register, with the redacted line visible, cause administered. No note accompanied them. No donor's name was recorded. The archivist who catalogued them added only one marginal note, to be filed under suppressed histories. Celia reclaimed. By the late 20th century, Celia was no longer shadow. She became an emblem. Historians began to name her in lectures, to cite the artifacts not as curiosities but as testimonies. Plays were written, poems published. One historian described her thus: not merely a cook, but a chemist of necessity, not merely a servant, but a tactician of silence. She fed them what they had long fed her: bitterness, binding and death. Yet always there remained the unanswered question: was it Celia who ground the powder, or was she merely the hand that carried a master's experiment to the table? The uncertainty itself became part of her power. The absence of certainty made her legend inextinguishable. The present dread. Today, visitors who walk the grounds of Riverside, what little remains, report strange sensations. The air smells faintly sweet, like burnt sugar. In photographs, blurs appear near the ruined hearth, shaped like a woman's figure. Locals say, no wedding feast held within 20 miles of the site has gone without misfortune. Sudden illness, fainting, broken glasses, inexplicable quarrels. Whether curse or coincidence, the shadow of that 1847 feast clings like smoke. The archivist's closing words: and so the tale rests here. The family is gone, their wealth scattered, their name blackened. The parish is silent, its registers bled by redaction. The medical society holds its folio like a wound. The artifacts, goblet, ledger, recipe, apron remain, silent but still breathing their truth. And Celia, she lingers, in song, in rumor, in the margins of archives and the corners of kitchens. One cannot taste sugared almonds without recalling her hand. One cannot lift a goblet of silver without imagining the weight of her name, etched in soot-stained brick. This is the persistence of vengeance, not swift, not clean, but enduring. So remember this: not all inheritances are written in wills. Some are written in blood, in silence, in kitchens where walls remember names. And if ever you drink from a goblet at a wedding feast, pause first, ask whose hands prepared the cup, ask what history sweetens the sugar, because history is never buried, it ferments, and sometimes it poisons.